Thank you, Noel, and thanks to the Foreign Policy Association for inviting me and for announcing something that I may receive, which is really great. But let me concentrate on the task at hand, which is this book that I've written called A Solitary War, a Diplomat's Chronicle of the Iraq War and its Lessons. I felt that this was a book that I had sort of caught inside my chest, and I had to put out, in a sense, as Kofi Annan said very kindly when he wrote the foreword, a record that needed to be known. After spending almost 2 years in the Security Council and having seen the Iraq tragedy from two sides, first in the capital, while I was Minister Secretary General of the government, and then when I came as ambassador to the United Nations, straight to the Security Council. And I think the book is divided in three parts that I think tell a lot about the story of Iraq and the aftermath. First, the missed opportunities in the run-up to the war. Then second, what I would call the backtrack from unilateralism, or the U-turn that there was in U.S. policy towards the Iraq war. And third, the lessons that one could draw well beyond Iraq, putting the sight into the future. In the run-up to the war, I recall in October of 2002 when President Bush said that the United Nations risked becoming irrelevant if it didn't disarm Iraq, if it didn't take the challenge of Saddam Hussein. And later on, as time began to pass by, we got, those of us who were in the Security Council, phone calls and conversations that were increasingly urgent about the need to use force against Saddam Hussein because of the alleged reason that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. We, at least I can speak on behalf of Chile, we felt that we needed evidence in order to get to such an extreme point as the use of force, which in the Charter of the United Nations, it is spelled out in Chapter 7. And the idea was that if you are going to use force, it is because there is a threat to peace and security, not to put away a dictator. And definitely Saddam Hussein was a tyrant and one of the most repressive ones in the world. But the Security Council is not for that. There are many unsavory characters throughout the world that one would like to get rid of, but that's not what the Security Council is all about. And the idea was then we should have evidence. And we were willing to use force and to vote for the use of force so long as the evidence was there, so long as we could have time so that the inspectors, the UN arms inspector, would do their job. In fact, President of Chile at the time, Ricardo Lagos, called Hans Blix, and we talked in detail to him about how much time it was needed. This was late February of 2003. And he said 30 days at least. And President Lagos said no, 3 weeks. And that's what we settled for. And at the same time, the British were coming out with a so-called second resolution that was not all that far apart from what Chile was thinking, as well as the group of the so-called U6, the undecided six, countries that had not taken up clear postures on the use of force towards Iraq. On the one hand, evidently, the United States and Great Britain, and on the other side, France, Germany, and others. And the undecided were Chile, Pakistan, Cameroon, Guinea, Angola, countries that, and Mexico, evidently Mexico and Chile, that were willing, as I said, to use force so long as we had the evidence that indeed there were weapons of mass destruction. And we got ideas from various other countries that were willing to help, friends of the United States, like Canada, for example, that came up with ideas of benchmarks. Like even Germany, that was quite interesting, his foreign minister, about ideas that could avoid war, in essence, while accomplishing the task of finding out whether there were weapons of mass destruction or not, and if they were, then to use force through an approval of a resolution. In fact, at that time, President Lagos has had multiple conversations with President Bush, with Tony Blair. Tony Blair, in fact, was about to go to Chile. This was a secret at the time. And he sent Sir David Manning as a special envoy. And up to this day, at least in the book, I think now he hasn't become a secret. It's history. But he did go to Chile. And many thought that there was a possibility, but patience had run out. Patience has run out basically in Washington. So that even though we said 3 weeks, and even though we had tough conversations, I had some of those that I narrate in the book when the then National Security Advisor called me and we had a half-an-hour conversation. The National Security Advisor is a very good friend of mine, and we had been classmates while doing our PhD together, and I explained the many reasons why the U.S. shouldn't use force unless we had the evidence, and I was given many reasons of why the United States apparently wanted to use force. And in fact, I heard a phrase that I put in the book: we will go into Iraq with or without the United Nations. So we made the efforts, we missed the opportunities, and we didn't do what the United States did in 1991 in the Gulf War, when in the view of the use of force and the threat to peace and security by Saddam Hussein when he invaded Kuwait, the United States government, led by George H.W. Bush, went to the Security Council, asked for the use of force, and a resolution was passed that ended up in the defeat and withdrawal of the Hussein forces from Iraq, from Kuwait. Mind you, that war was, since it was accompanied by allies, it wasn't a solitary war, was financed more than 80% by allies, not by the U.S. taxpayer. Second part, you know what happened up to the the moment of the invasion. We made the efforts up to the last moment. Some of the conversations I narrate that President Lagos had with President Bush, it was very frustrating because we felt that this was taking that marvelous novel by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, Story of a Death Foretold, that this was a story of a war foretold. And we couldn't avoid putting ourselves in the middle and looking for another alternative. When the invasion took place, it was one of the worst moments for the United Nations, and I saw that directly in the Security Council. Multilateralism had been torn to pieces, basically. And what happened was that the UN Security Council was seen as useful only for two things: to lift the sanctions that had had a stranglehold on Iraq for 13 years, and in addition to that, to begin a humanitarian relief effort. And at the same time, the UN Security Council was asked to name a special envoy for those tasks, humanitarian relief, and to begin composing what could be local and national authorities. Kofi Annan named Sergio Vieira de Mello, who went there, and Sergio was a good friend, and he was a charmer, first of all, and an extremely enthusiastic man who convinced soon enough the administrator of Iraq, Mr. Paul Bremer, that they should soon have a governing council and shove aside the idea of having a constitution first. And he came to the Security Council while I was there then to defend the constitution of this governing council with so much strength that in the end we could not refuse. And we know what happened on the 19th of August when the bombing killed him as well as 22 other UN staff members in Baghdad. After that, I think that was a watershed, because the war came into a spiral, into chaos. And the idea then was, what do we do about it? Because supposedly the war had been terminated with mission accomplished, but the war was getting tougher and tougher on the ground. It was getting really complicated, and there was apparently no plan B. The United Nations then began to be viewed as perhaps the instrument that could accelerate a transfer of power to the Iraqis that could calm the situation from a political standpoint. And then we became them increasingly not part of the problem, as we had been seen in the run-up to the war, but part of the solution. And the idea was that there should be a timetable for transfer of sovereignty. Ideas were put forward. There was this notion that perhaps Iraq could have a caucus-like process. The caucus is something so American. It's so alien to many of us. And evidently was not well received in Iraq. And in fact, Grand Ayatollah al-Sistani soon enough began demonstrating in the streets, demanding direct elections. And how could we do that? Everybody opined that organizing elections seriously would take a great deal of time. And Ayatollah al-Sistani, when the timetable was delivered with the idea that transfer of sovereignty would occur in June of 2004 through direct elections, said, well, that's what we want, unless the United Nations tell us otherwise. And then the United States asked for the help of the UN again to send Lakhdar Brahimi to try to negotiate a deal. And the deal would be, let us first put a caretaker government. And after we have a caretaker government, let's organize elections as they should be organized. And sure enough, Lakhdar Brahimi, the skillful diplomat that he is, went over there, spoke to all sectors of society. I remember the briefings that we had in the Security Council where he identified sectors that I didn't know that existed in Iraq. He spoke to everyone. There were Christians, there were all sectors that he spoke to, not just the traditional Shiites, Sunnis, and Kurds. And he came up, sure enough, with a good formula that meant the government of Prime Minister Alawi, and with a solution that led all sectors to be satisfied. And then after that, we were the ones to organize the elections that successfully were organized in January 2005. I recall thinking and talking to Lakhdar and talking to the director of electoral affairs of the United Nations, that we're all in Iraq, by the way, with the threats to security, being in harm's way, organizing elections in Iraq. And I asked, how are you going to do it? What will be? There are no voter rolls. How are you going to do this? And they came up with a really bright idea. We're going to use their rationing cards as the ID and the voter roll. And it worked. 8.5 million people voted for the first time in democratic election. Mind you, many women out of those 8.5 million people. And then I recall, as if it was today, President Bush speaking from the White House and saying, I thank the Iraqis for having been so brave, and I thank the United Nations for what they've done. Without the UN, it couldn't have been possible. Without the UN, the Iraqis wouldn't have agreed to do the elections as we did on the dates that we said. They wouldn't have had a caretaker agreement. And then he said, now you have to help us in the next stage, because a constitution must be drafted with the help of the UN. And then in September of 2005, I saw President Bush thanking again the UN and saying, but don't leave because there are many tasks ahead. So there were two moments here where there was a U-turn from the UN being seen as irrelevant, as not following its founding principles, and then as having been the solution, at least the political solution to Iraq, to the regaining of sovereignty, and to at least some sort of normalization. And the task continues. The last resolution, of course, then there were new elections, there was a constitution, help with the UN, and the last resolution last year was August 2007, where the UN was asked to do more things, to collaborate in the process of internal reconciliation in Iraq, to help the Iraqis determine how they are going to divide the riches out of oil among themselves, the relationship between the central government and the provinces, a series of other complicated tasks, mind you, still with the threat that we know still exists on the ground, with an increased number, though,